The knock came just as the last light of the day slipped behind the Wyoming hills. Abigail Harper had been expecting trouble. Instead, she found a weary rancher standing on her porch with a frightened little girl hiding behind his coat. The man removed his hat, lowered his eyes, and spoke only one sentence. "I was told this ranch might still have room for honest people." Abigail tightened her grip on the shotgun resting against the porch rail. Out on the frontier, strangers often carried bad news. Some carried lies, others carried danger, very few carried hope. She studied the man from head to toe. Dust covered his boots so heavily that their original color was impossible to guess. His long brown coat had been stitched together more than once with rough thread. One shoulder sagged beneath a faded bedroll, and the horse standing behind him looked almost as tired as its owner. Then she noticed the little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her tiny fingers clung tightly to the back of the man's coat, while only one frightened blue eye peeked around the fabric. The child held a cloth rabbit so tightly that its ears had nearly come loose. Neither of them looked like drifters searching for easy food. They looked like people who had walked through too many hard days. "What exactly do you want?" Abigail asked without lowering the shotgun. The man answered honestly. "My name is Luke Bennett." He paused before speaking again. "I heard there was a ranch whose owner needed someone willing to work from sunrise until dark." Abigail frowned. "And where did you hear that?" "A feed merchant in Dry Creek." She recognized the name immediately. Old Mr. Lawson knew nearly everyone within 50 miles. Luke continued quietly. He said the woman who owned this place cared more about character than fancy words. Abigail almost smiled. "Mr. Lawson always talks too much." For the first time, Luke allowed himself a faint smile. "So I've learned." Silence settled across the porch. Only the evening wind moved, stirring the tall prairie grass around the house. Abigail noticed the little girl glance toward the smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. Her eyes followed the scent of fresh biscuits carried on the breeze. The child quickly looked away. They were hungry. Abigail had seen enough empty stomachs during difficult winters to recognize one without asking. Still, she wasn't foolish. "Who's the little one?" Luke gently reached behind himself. "My daughter." The little girl refused to move. He spoke softly. "It's all right, Rosie." Slowly, the child stepped halfway into view. She kept one hand wrapped around her rabbit and the other gripping her father's coat. Abigail expected a greeting. Instead, Rosie simply watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. The silence felt heavier than words. "Has she always been this quiet?" Abigail asked. Luke's expression changed. There was sadness there. "No." He swallowed before continuing. "Not before her mother passed." The words hung in the cool evening air. Abigail looked at Rosie again. The little girl's face seemed older than it should. Children should have been chasing butterflies or laughing beside creeks. This one looked as though she spent every day waiting for another goodbye. Abigail slowly lowered the shotgun until its barrel rested against the porch floor. "You've come a long way." Luke nodded. "Almost 3 weeks. On foot." When the horse grew too tired. Abigail looked toward the worn gelding standing patiently beside the fence. Its ribs showed beneath its coat. It had carried everything the little family owned. She understood then. These weren't people searching for comfort. They were searching for somewhere life might finally stop getting worse. Before she could say another word, Rosie suddenly whispered something so softly that only Abigail heard it. "We don't stay anywhere very long." The word struck deeper than any loud cry. Abigail looked at Luke. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I'm trying to change that." Those 6 quiet words carried more pain than any long explanation ever could. For reasons she couldn't explain, Abigail set the shotgun against the wall beside the door. "You both look frozen." Luke immediately shook his head. "We can sleep in the barn." "I didn't ask where you plan to sleep." He looked confused. "I said you both look frozen." She stepped aside and opened the front door. "Come inside before supper gets cold." Luke didn't move. Neither did Rosie. Almost as though kindness had become something they no longer trusted. Abigail sighed. "I promise the stew tastes better hot." Rosie looked up at her father. Luke gave a small nod. Only then did the little girl slowly climb the porch steps. As she passed Abigail, she accidentally dropped her cloth rabbit. Before Rosie could reach it, Abigail bent down and gently picked it up. One of the rabbit's button eyes hung loose by a single thread. "You've taken good care of this fellow," Abigail said. Rosie accepted it carefully. "My mama made him." Her tiny voice almost disappeared with the wind. Abigail handed it back without another question. Some memories deserved silence. Inside the farmhouse, warmth filled every corner. The fire crackled inside the stone fireplace, while fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. Rosie's eyes grew wide. Luke quietly removed his hat again. "You don't owe us this." Abigail placed 3 bowls onto the table. "No." She looked directly at him. "But everyone deserves one warm meal before tomorrow. Ask something difficult of them." For several moments, nobody spoke. Rosie climbed carefully onto the chair nearest the fireplace. She held the cloth rabbit on her lap while staring at the bowl of stew, as though afraid it might disappear. Luke noticed. "You can eat, sweetheart." Rosie looked toward Abigail first. "Thank you, ma'am." It was the first time the little girl had smiled, and even then it lasted only a heartbeat. Still, Abigail noticed it. During supper, Luke answered every question honestly. He had once owned a small ranch near Bitter Ridge. A sickness had taken his wife during a bitter winter. The following spring brought drought. Then debt. By autumn, the bank claimed everything except one horse, a wagon, and the few belongings they could carry. Since then, he and Rosie had traveled from ranch to ranch searching for work. Some people promised wages they never paid. Others turned them away the moment they saw a child. "So why come here?" Abigail finally asked. Luke looked around the modest farmhouse before answering. "Because I stopped looking for a job." She tilted her head. "I started looking for a place where my daughter might finally feel safe." Abigail didn't answer immediately. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the old windows. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses stamped its hoof. The lonely ranch suddenly didn't feel quite as lonely. Rosie quietly reached into the pocket of her little dress. She pulled out a tiny dried wildflower, its petals faded but carefully protected. She placed it beside Abigail's bowl. "For letting us come inside." Abigail stared at the flower. No expensive gift could ever have meant more. If you've ever believed that one small act of kindness can change someone's life, stay with this story. Sometimes the greatest families begin with nothing more than an open door and the courage to trust one another. As the fire burned lower that evening, Abigail believed she had simply offered shelter to two weary strangers. She had no way of knowing that before another sunrise, something hidden inside the old red barn would reveal a secret that would change every one of their lives forever. The rooster had not yet crowed when Abigail heard footsteps outside her bedroom window. She slipped on her boots, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and quietly stepped onto the porch. The eastern sky was only beginning to lighten, painting the prairie in soft shades of blue and silver. Near the broken fence, Luke was already working. Without waking anyone, he had gathered fallen rails, replaced cracked posts, and was stretching fresh wire between them. His movements were steady and careful, as though he respected every inch of land that did not belong to him. Abigail leaned against the porch post for a moment. Most men who had offered to help around the ranch spent more time talking than working. Luke had not spoken 10 words since supper. Yet half the morning's work was already finished. He finally noticed her watching. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "The cattle would have wandered through this gap before breakfast." Abigail folded her arms. "You've been awake long. Since the moon was still out. You didn't have to start so early." He smiled faintly. "I've learned that hard days become harder if you sleep through the cool hours." She could not argue with that. Before she answered, another small figure appeared in the doorway. Rosie stood quietly, with the cloth rabbit tucked beneath one arm. She looked from her father to Abigail before carefully walking down the porch steps. Instead of hiding behind Luke, she stopped halfway between them. It was only a few feet. But for Rosie, it might as well have been a mile. Abigail smiled gently. "Good morning." Rosie gave the smallest nod. "Morning." Luke looked at his daughter with quiet surprise. She had greeted someone other than him. It was a tiny moment. But both adults understood how important it was. By breakfast, the kitchen smelled of bacon, biscuits, and fresh coffee. Rosie sat silently, swinging her feet beneath the chair. Every few moments she glanced around the room, as though trying to memorize it. The curtains. The old clock. The rocking chair beside the fireplace. Children who had lost their homes often memorized places before they believed they could belong there. After breakfast, Abigail showed Luke around the ranch. The south pasture needed clearing. One barn door barely hung on its hinges. The windmill had stopped turning weeks ago. Several fields still waited to be planted. Luke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply rolled up his sleeves. "We'll get there." "Not you." "We." The single word settled somewhere deep inside Abigail's heart. By noon, the broken barn door stood straight again. The windmill creaked back to life. Fresh water poured into the waiting trough. Even the old ranch dogs seemed to follow Luke from one task to another, wagging their tails as though they had known him for years. Abigail found herself smiling more than she had in months. Yet one mystery continued to trouble her. Rosie. The little girl never wandered far from the farmhouse. She watched birds from the porch. She picked wildflowers near the fence. She helped gather eggs without being asked. But every time another rider passed along the distant road, she froze. Her shoulders tightened. Her little hands search for her cloth rabbit. Once, a traveling merchant stopped to ask directions. Rosie disappeared inside the house before the man even reached the gate. That evening, Abigail quietly asked Luke about it while they carried hay into the stable. She acts like she's expecting someone. Luke stopped lifting the bale. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor. She is. Abigail waited. Luke spoke softly. Not someone she's hoping to see. The words carried enough sorrow to stop further questions. Later that night, the answer came without either of them expecting it. A frightened cry echoed through the hallway. "Daddy!" Luke rushed from the small guest room. Abigail followed close behind. Rosie sat upright in bed, shaking so badly that tears rolled down her cheeks. She reached desperately for her father. Luke sat beside her and gently wrapped his arms around her. "I'm here. They found us." "No, sweetheart. They'll make us leave again." Luke stroked her hair. "No one is taking you anywhere." Rosie buried her face against his shoulder. "They always say we can't stay." Abigail stood silently in the doorway. Every word tightened something inside her chest. After Rosie finally fell asleep again, Luke stepped onto the porch. The stars stretched across the Wyoming sky like scattered diamonds. Abigail joined him. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, she broke the silence. "What happened?" Luke rested both hands on the porch rail. "After my wife died, I took whatever work I could." He stared into the darkness. "Some ranchers welcomed us." He paused. "Others didn't want a child around." Abigail remained quiet. Rosie would unpack her little things. A faint smile crossed his face before fading again. Then a week later, we'd be told to move on. He swallowed hard. After enough times, she stopped believing any place could become home. The wind carried dust across the yard. Abigail looked toward the guest room window, where a tiny candle still burned. No child should have to live like that. Luke nodded slowly. "I know. I tried. I just never had enough." His voice cracked for the first time since arriving. Abigail realized something important. Luke blamed himself for every hardship his daughter had endured, even the ones he could never have controlled. The next afternoon, Rosie wandered into the old garden behind the farmhouse. Most of the flowers had long since withered. Only a few stubborn blooms remained. Abigail found the little girl carefully pressing seeds into the soil. "What are you planting?" she asked. Rosie looked up shyly. "My mama used to say flowers remember places." Abigail knelt beside her. "And what do you think?" Rosie gently covered another seed with dirt. "I hope these remember here." Abigail's heart nearly broke. She picked up another handful of seeds. "Then let's give them every chance." For nearly an hour they worked together without saying much. Sometimes healing began in silence. When they finished, Rosie looked at the freshly planted row. "They'll come back next spring." "I'm sure they will," Abigail replied. Rosie hesitated. "Will we still be here then?" Abigail looked into the little girl's hopeful eyes. She wanted to promise forever. Instead, she answered honestly, "I'd like that very much." Rosie smiled. This time it stayed. That evening, Luke noticed his daughter laughing as Abigail chased two playful puppies across the yard. He had not heard that sound since before his wife's illness. He quietly turned away so neither of them would notice the tears gathering in his eyes. Sometimes joy arrived so gently that it caught a person completely unprepared. As darkness settled over the ranch, the three of them shared supper on the porch. The sky glowed orange behind the distant mountains. For the first time in many years, the old farmhouse felt alive. But miles away, another rider studied the Harper ranch from the top of a lonely ridge. He unfolded a weathered paper, compared it to the farmhouse below, and smiled to himself. Then he turned his horse toward the ranch. By this time tomorrow, a long-buried claim from Abigail's late father's past would arrive at her doorstep, and it threatened not only the future of the ranch, but the fragile home that Luke and Rosie had just begun to believe was real. The rider arrived just after sunrise. Dust followed his horse through the front gate as Abigail carried a bucket toward the chicken coop. Luke looked up from sharpening an old fence post. Rosie stopped feeding the hens. The stranger wore a clean black coat that looked far too expensive for ranch work. A leather case rested beneath one arm, and his expression carried the confidence of a man who rarely expected to hear the word no. He climbed down from his horse and glanced around the property before speaking. "Which one of you is Miss Abigail Harper?" "I am." He tipped his hat politely. "My name is Nathan Briggs. I represent the office of Judge Harlan in Dry Creek." Abigail's smile disappeared. "What business brings the judge to my ranch?" Nathan opened the leather case and removed several folded papers. "I'm afraid it concerns this land." Luke quietly stepped back, allowing Abigail to handle the conversation herself. Nathan unfolded one document. "According to these records, your late father accepted a large loan nearly 12 years ago." Abigail frowned. "My father never mentioned a loan. The payment stopped shortly before his death." She stared at him. "That can't be right." Nathan handed her the document. "The signature appears to be his." Abigail studied the faded handwriting. It looked like her father's name. Yet something about it felt wrong. The letters were uneven. The final stroke looked forced. She had watched her father sign hundreds of receipts over the years. This signature lacked the confidence of his hand. "My father would never have hidden something like this." Nathan spoke calmly. "I understand your feelings. But unless the debt is settled within 30 days, ownership of this ranch may legally transfer." Rosie looked up at Luke. "Are we leaving again?" Luke immediately knelt beside her. "No one has said we're leaving." The little girl gripped his hand tightly. Nathan returned the papers to his case. "I'll return in 1 month." He tipped his hat again before riding away. Silence settled across the yard. Even the breeze seemed quieter. Abigail stood frozen, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. Luke waited until the rider disappeared beyond the hill. "Do you believe those papers?" She looked toward the house where her father had spent the last years of his life. "I don't know what to believe." That afternoon, no one spoke much. Luke repaired harnesses inside the barn. Rosie quietly colored little flowers in the dirt with a stick. Abigail sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the papers again and again. Something refused to fit. Her father had been careful. He kept every receipt, every bill, every letter. If he had borrowed money, there had to be another record somewhere. She suddenly stood. The attic. Luke looked over from the doorway. What is it? My father kept boxes upstairs. They climbed the narrow wooden steps together. Dust floated through the sunlight pouring beneath the roof. Old trunks lined the walls. Broken lanterns. Horse blankets. A rocking chair missing one arm. Abigail opened one wooden chest after another. Nothing. Then beneath a faded quilt, she found a small cedar box. Its brass latch had turned green with age. She lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of neatly tied bundles of letters. Most were written by her mother. Others contained ranch records. Luke carefully searched beside her. Hours passed. The afternoon sun drifted lower. Just as Abigail began losing hope, a folded journal slipped from between two ledgers. Her father's handwriting covered every page. She opened it carefully. The final entries had been written only weeks before his passing. Her eyes moved quickly across the lines. Then she stopped. Her breathing caught. Luke noticed immediately. What is it? She handed him the journal. Near the bottom of one page, her father had written, Nathaniel Briggs keeps asking me to sign another agreement. I refused again today. He says no one will question the papers after I'm gone. Luke looked up. The writer's name. Nathan Briggs. The same surname. The same family. Abigail turned another page. There was more. If anything happens to me, the original deed remains hidden where your mother always kept her favorite hymn book. Abigail closed the journal. Her heart pounded. The bookshelf. They hurried downstairs. The old bookshelf still stood beside the fireplace. Every book remained exactly where her father had left it. Abigail searched until she found the worn hymn book. Its leather cover had almost fallen apart. She opened it. Nothing. Her shoulders dropped. Luke gently examined the spine. It feels thicker here. Carefully, he pressed the cracked leather. A hidden compartment opened inside the cover. A folded document slid onto the floor. Abigail unfolded it with trembling hands. The original deed. Signed. Witnessed. Completely different from the paper Nathan Briggs had delivered. Luke smiled quietly. This ranch is yours. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. For the first time today. She laughed softly through those tears. I can finally breathe. Rosie ran into the room after hearing them. What's wrong? Abigail knelt beside her. Nothing's wrong. She hugged the little girl. Something very right just happened. Rosie smiled, though she didn't fully understand. That evening, the three of them sat together on the porch. The sky glowed with deep shades of orange and crimson. For a little while, the fear that had settled over the ranch seemed far away. Luke watched Rosie chase fireflies across the yard. I haven't seen her play like that in years. Abigail smiled. She's beginning to believe tomorrow will still be here. Luke remained quiet. There were days, he admitted, when I worried she'd forget how to be a child. Abigail looked toward Rosie. Children healed slowly. like broken fences, like damaged fields. With patience, with care, with people who refuse to give up on them. Rosie suddenly ran back, carrying something in both hands. I made this. She held out 3 tiny flower crowns, woven from prairie blooms. One for Luke. One for Abigail. One for herself. Luke laughed. I don't think cowboys wear flowers. Rosie folded her arms. They do today. Abigail laughed harder than she had in years. Luke finally placed the little crown on his head. Rosie clapped happily. For one peaceful evening, the hardships of the past seemed very far away. But long after everyone had gone to bed, a lantern burned inside the Dry Creek Hotel. Nathan Briggs sat across from an older man with silver hair. The man looked over the recovered loan papers. So she still believes this is only about money. Nathan nodded. Yes. The older man smiled coldly. Good. He leaned back in his chair. She still has no idea what is buried beneath that ranch. Nathan carefully folded the forged documents. And if she discovers it? The older man's smile disappeared. Then we make certain she never has the chance. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant prairie. The storm heading toward Harper Ranch carried far more than rain. The storm arrived before dawn. Heavy rain swept across the prairie, and fierce winds rattled every window of the Harper farmhouse. Lightning flashed over the hills, turning the dark landscape silver for a heartbeat before everything disappeared into shadow again. Abigail had barely finished securing the barn doors when Luke came running from the south pasture. The lower fence is gone, he called over the wind. The cattle are moving toward the creek. Without hesitation, they saddled 2 horses. I'll bring them back, Luke said. I'll help. No, he answered firmly but gently. Rosie needs someone she trusts. Abigail looked toward the house, where the little girl stood watching through the window with her cloth rabbit pressed against the glass. She nodded. Come back safely. Luke smiled. I plan to. He rode into the storm, disappearing behind sheets of rain. Hours crawled by. Rosie sat beside the fireplace, twisting the loose ear of her rabbit between her fingers. Will Daddy find the cows? He will. Will he come back? Abigail knelt beside her. He always has. Rosie tried to smile, but fear still lingered in her eyes. The storm finally weakened shortly after noon. The front door opened, and Luke stepped inside soaked from head to toe. Mud covered his boots, and rain dripped from his hat. Before he could say a word, Rosie raced across the room and wrapped both arms around him. You came back. Luke held her tightly. I told you I would. Abigail quietly looked away, giving father and daughter a moment they had earned. Later that afternoon, another rider approached the ranch. It was Nathan Briggs. This time he wasn't alone. The older gentleman from the hotel rode beside him. His sharp gray eyes searched every corner of the property before stopping on Abigail. I believe introductions are overdue, he said. My name is Walter Briggs. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Abigail suddenly remembered. Years ago, her father had mentioned a neighboring rancher named Briggs who had tried several times to buy part of the Harper land. Each offer had been refused. Walter removed his gloves. I understand you've discovered some old papers. Abigail held the original deed firmly in her hands. My father also kept a journal. For the first time, Walter's expression changed. Only slightly. But Luke noticed. The journal mentions your family. Walter forced a smile. Old memories are often unreliable. They're very clear. Abigail stepped forward. My father wrote that someone kept pressuring him to sign papers he didn't trust. Nathan shifted uneasily in his saddle. Walter answered calmly. A dying man's imagination. Luke finally spoke. You haven't even asked to see the journal. Silence followed. Walter realized his mistake. Abigail continued. He also wrote exactly where he hid the original deed. She unfolded the document. The land was never for sale. Walter's polite smile vanished. You don't understand what you're protecting. No, Abigail replied. I understand exactly what I'm protecting. Walter looked across the ranch, then toward the distant hills beyond the south pasture. Finally he sighed. It isn't the ranch house. It isn't the cattle. It's what's underneath. Luke frowned. What do you mean? Walter looked at the hills. Nearly 20 years ago, surveyors believed there might be silver beneath this land. Abigail stared at him. My father never said anything. He refused every offer. Walter's voice softened. He believed that if silver was discovered, the valley would fill with speculators. He wanted this land to remain a home. Luke slowly understood everything. So you forged papers to take it after he was gone. Walter lowered his eyes. I spent years chasing wealth. He looked older than he had only moments before. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what mattered. Nathan looked at his uncle in disbelief. You said no one would ever know. Walter didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. Just then another horse approached from the road. Judge Harlan himself. 2 deputies rode behind him. An elderly lawyer from Dry Creek had discovered irregularities in several old land filings and brought them to the judge's attention that very morning. After examining Abigail's deed and reading the journal entries, the judge looked directly at Walter. I believe this matter belongs before the county court. Walter offered no resistance. He simply nodded. Perhaps, after carrying the weight of dishonesty for so many years, he was finally too tired to keep carrying it. Nathan lowered his head. I'm sorry. The apology was quiet. Whether it was enough was another matter. The deputies escorted both men away. The ranch grew silent once more. Rosie tugged gently on Abigail's sleeve. Does that mean we can stay? Abigail looked toward Luke. He looked back at her. Neither of them answered immediately. Some promises deserved careful words. That evening, neighbors began arriving one by one. News traveled quickly across the prairie. Some brought lumber. Others brought fresh seed. One family delivered 2 healthy calves. Old Mr. Lawson, the feed merchant whose directions had first led Luke to the ranch, climbed down from his wagon carrying a small apple tree. I figured every family ought to plant something that lasts longer than themselves. Together they dug a hole beside the farmhouse. Rosie carefully placed the young tree into the ground. Luke covered the roots with soil. Abigail poured the first bucket of water around it. "When this tree grows," Rosie whispered, "we'll still be here." Abigail smiled. "Yes, this time we will." Autumn slowly gave way to another winter. Snow settled softly across the fields. Inside the farmhouse, warmth replaced loneliness. The empty chair at the table was no longer empty. The laughter that had once disappeared from the old ranch became part of every evening. When spring finally returned, tiny green shoots appeared across the fields. Even more beautiful were the colorful flowers blooming in the garden Rosie and Abigail had planted together months earlier. Rosie ran happily between the rows. "They remembered." Abigail laughed. "I told you they would." Luke watched them from the porch. For the first time since losing his wife, the heavy sadness he had carried every day no longer felt impossible to bear. One quiet evening, as the prairie glowed beneath another golden sunset, he stood beside Abigail on the porch where they had first met. "I came here looking for work," he said softly. "But somewhere along the way—" He looked toward Rosie chasing butterflies near the apple tree. "I found something I thought we'd lost forever." Abigail smiled. "A home." Luke nodded. "And someone willing to share it." She reached for his hand. Neither rushed the moment. Neither needed grand speeches. Some of life's greatest promises were made in quiet silence. Rosie looked back toward the porch. She grinned and ran to them, slipping one small hand into Luke's and the other into Abigail's. "So," she asked with a hopeful smile, "can I stop calling this the Harper Ranch?" Abigail looked at Luke before answering. "What would you call it?" Rosie thought for a moment. Then she smiled the biggest smile either of them had ever seen. "Our ranch." Luke laughed. Abigail felt tears warm her eyes. "Our ranch," she repeated. And somehow those two simple words healed years of loneliness, grief, and uncertainty. Not every family is connected by the names written in an old family Bible. Sometimes they are brought together by a dusty road, a stranger brave enough to knock on an unfamiliar door, and one woman courageous enough to answer with kindness instead of fear. The Harper Ranch remained standing for many years, not because of hidden silver beneath the ground, but because of the love, trust, and second chances shared above it. The greatest treasure they ever found was never buried in the earth. It was waiting inside three hearts that finally discovered they belonged together. If this journey touched your heart, thank you for staying until the very end. Tell us in the comments what moment meant the most to you, and if you enjoy heartfelt Wild West stories of hope, courage, and second chances, we'd love to have you join us for the next adventure. Until then, may kindness always lead you home.